Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for finishing up a week with us this Thursday as we continue through a section of Exodus that we're trying to kind of hit the ground running, move through a lot of material relatively quickly. We shift focus a little bit. We've been talking about the tabernacle and some of the accoutrements, some of the accessories for the tabernacle. Now we move into some of the decorations. I think what's really interesting, we get to chapter 28, we have vestments for the priesthood. The idea that there is a priesthood, it has not, that's not been assumed in the story. So the fact that we get to this part, and now Aaron and his people, the Levites are kind of given that specific task of serving as the priests, and there will be garments that distinguish them. Those garments are very well thought out. They're very scripted here. Chapter 29, there's a significant chapter, significant section on the way in which those priests are ordained and some of their duties. Then 30, we get into the altar. We get into, the sanctuary, the basin, the anointing oil and incense. And again, Michael, as has kind of been the theme of the week, the micro look at this stuff is maybe briefly interesting, and then I think becomes a little bit tedious. So I think as we've been trying to do, to kind of back out and to say, what is the big picture here of a temple and a priesthood? And you said something yesterday as we finished that really planted an idea. It was a comment, something to the effect of the big things and little things. And, what's interesting is the way that dichotomy works in this book. We've seen miraculous plagues. We saw Moses courageously stand and lead the people. We've seen faith look like trusting God in the face of hunger and thirst and uncertainty and even danger. And now we see that faith is also these little things like somebody's got to embroider the curtain. Somebody's got to make the priest's robe. Somebody is going to hack stone and build an altar and get it the right dimensions. Somebody's building an ark. And it is amazing the way in which that kind of represents the idea that faith is always some combination of in our life of big challenges and big sacrifices and little things that need done. And it's easy to think that God doesn't care about the little things, except we're in a section with about 8 chapters that are very detail-oriented.
Yeah.
I mean, God doesn't just say, hey, build a tabernacle.
Right.
God gives dimensions. God gives curtain instruction. God gives embroidery instructions. And somewhere in Israel, in the desert, there was an Israelite embroidering the curtain because God said to do it. And it's just an interesting way to frame these texts, these stories.
Because on one hand, I think most of us measure our life by those momentous events. We measure our life by the going through the Red Sea events. We don't tend to measure our life in the intervening time between them. That's where Exodus is very honest, I think. It is honest about the mundane. And I'm going to circle back around to that word mundane, because in some ways I think you could make an argument that this text is actually the opposite of being mundane. But bear with me for a second. It's this season of 40 years. It's the impermanence of their homes. It's the sheer trust and faith that this meandering tribe has, that they will have the food, the water, the resource that they're going to need, that their flocks will be cared for. They are putting their entire lives in the trust that God is going to carry them safely through this very difficult season, which is what is represented by the wilderness. Wilderness is not just a faraway place. It's a place of struggle in the course of the Bible and in the sort of lingua franca of the scriptures. So here we have this beautiful sort of even ruddy image of the people piecing it together day by day. It's the common life that they're living where we see God's faithfulness and their constant return to faith. But then I think there's a very important turn in the story as well, Clint. I'm going to look here. This is chapter 30, verse 27 or so. They're talking about the table, utensils, lampstands. They're talking about sacred anointing oil. And there's this language in verse 29, you will consecrate them so that they may be most holy. Whatever touches them will be holy. You will anoint Aaron, his sons, consecrate them in order that they may serve as priests. This language of consecration, this idea of things becoming holy, is the opposite of the mundane. It's that this common stuff is now going to have a dividing line between their common use and between their sacred purpose. And that, you mentioned before, Clint, has a beautiful kind of connection to our idea of worship spaces, even to today. I mean, a room is a room. If you walk into a space with a roof over it, I mean, that room could serve as a shelter to live in, though it may not be ideal for that. But when you're a worshiping congregation, your sanctuary is not just a room with four walls and a roof over your head. It becomes a holy place. It becomes set apart away from common uses so that the people might, in the midst of a common week, come and have an experience, a reminder of that which is set apart, which is holy, ultimately God himself. And so I think these are the interesting tensions in a text like this. On one hand, man, I don't think most of us care about how much bronze was overlaid over things. On the other hand, I think many of us care deeply about the place where we have gone to worship, about the divided holy places, the consecrated places that have made an impact in our ability to remember and see God's work in our life. And maybe this then helps translate for us, Clint, how we live in that.
Yeah, Michael, it's easy to associate faithfulness and importance with big things. And I think one of the takeaways from these kind of chapters is the little things. Somebody was doing that. God gives this instruction, make this out of blue and purple and crimson yarn. Well, somebody had to make that yarn. Somebody had to sew that thing. Why, for instance, does God care that the priestly vestment is all blue? We have no idea. But God gives that instruction to the people, and the people carry it out. And, it's easy to undervalue, I think, our contributions to the faith when they seem small. The Sunday school teacher who shows up 32 times a year to help young children learn the faith, to help children meet Jesus, and then says, well, I just teach Sunday school.
Right.
The person who brings cookies on Sunday morning, who took the time to do that and set them out in front of people so that people could have a moment of fellowship and welcome. And yes, does it matter? It helps. It does something. The person who just sees somebody they don't know on Sunday morning and says, I'm not sure we've met. Welcome. Right. Hello. Right. It's good to have you here. It is not, we are tempted to think of the big things, the monumental things, but it is so often the little things that matter. And as you read this, one of the ways to read this is to look behind it and think about the people who really did these things, who shaped and created and carried and fixed and made, who carried out these things that God had instructed them to do. And to me, that gives a kind of dry section a little bit of life.
I think one of the things that this illustrates for us is how difficult it can be when you don't share a worshiping practice. When you, in other words, don't go to the tabernacle, when you don't go to do the sacrifices, when you don't have the consecrated oil, when you don't have the lampstands, when this isn't part of your worshiping experience, the vocabulary, the even practices that we have described in these chapters can seem very foreign. It can seem not inviting. And there's not anything inherently wrong with that. You got to remember, these people are living thousands of years ago. They're being called by God in a radically different place and time, and they are seeking to be faithful. But the God who was faithful to them is the same God who exists today. And I think maybe one translated kind of lesson that comes from texts like this is Christians too should be mindful, I think, Clint, of the vocabulary that we use with folks. I mean, there are some church words that we have gotten accustomed to that other people, maybe people who haven't been in the church, would have no clue what it means. I think there is a kind of translative lesson that we could learn here, that sometimes it's best to not call it the sacred altar and better to call it the table where we gather to practice the gift that Jesus gave us, right? I mean, we have words for lots of different things. We want to teach our kids why that matters and all these sort of nuances. On the other hand, there's merit in being simple in describing what the thing means. And I think the fact that we might struggle to read these texts and relate to them may be an analog lesson for us about how others might struggle to relate with our own faith vocabularies and practices.
Yeah, and one of the things to that end, Michael, that I think we see in the fact that there are 6 or 8 of these chapters, the people took this very seriously. I mean, this is included in the book by which they get their identity being led out of slavery. And in that same book, there's chapter after chapter of procedure and practice and instruction for even some of the most small and kind of micromanaged details. That's the seriousness with which they approached an organized faith, a practiced faith. And we take from that not the specifics. We don't have an altar, and we don't have an ephod, and we don't have these things. But I think what churches can take from that is serious reflection on why it is that we do what we do. That Christians can understand that the things that we use in worship, the tools by which we use to worship together, do have importance. They do have meaning. It matters what kind of music we sing and what kind of language we use and whether people are welcome. There is more to it than simply let's get together and see what happens. There is a kind of practiced familiarity that develops over time, and these are sacred things to the people. Now, we have to be careful with sacred things, as we're going to see in about a chapter, because sometimes those things are too sacred. But when understood properly, I think they offer us a lot of benefit.
So while you were talking there, Clint, it made me think that we maybe miss the difficulty of the task in worshiping regularly. And let me explain what I mean. Because it simultaneously requires holding tightly to the core of the faith, in the case of the Christian faith, holding tightly to Jesus Christ, and on the other hand, holding loosely, right? Holding in the other hand without grasping the accoutrements, the components of that worship. To discern between what is the thing that is held and retained and pushed forward and taught, what's the baton that goes to the next generation, and what is the thing that we recognize there can be flexibility and there can be change. This is a monumental sort of constant process in the midst of the church, and it takes graciousness, it takes compassion, it takes faith, it takes the willingness to lean into what are sometimes very difficult conversations, because newsflash, we don't all feel the same about what things should be held on tightly and what things should be held loosely. And church is, I think, unique in that it's a place where we don't expect it to be easy. I think when we show up, we recognize that the presence of sacred things is going to up the ante of the conversation. So the question that we build upon then is Jesus Christ Lord? The answer and profession of the church is yes, Jesus Christ is Lord. And so then everything is subject to him. And at our best, Clint, I think we try to resubmit. Even the stuff of worship, we try to resubmit to Jesus and allow for him to lead and guide us into the future. That's difficult work. It's communal work. It can't be done by one person, can't be done by the pastor alone, can't be done by a single church elder alone. It has to be done in conversation, and it has to be done over time. And I think that the monumental task of that is the kind of thing that fills out multiple books of Exodus. We look back on it and think, wow, that's dated and hard to read. They might look at that and say, no, it's a living snapshot. It's a captured moment of a people trying to do the same thing we're trying to do today, and we try to allow that to animate us and to remind us of why we're here.
I think people are often surprised when they encounter something that seems like a simple question, like, why do the prayers generally come before the sermon? Why does the offering generally come after the sermon? Why don't we do it? I think people who aren't necessarily immersed in that are always surprised by the level of thought and the history of thought that goes into something as simple as, when do we do the various elements of the service? And that is a living practice that has evolved, that has changed, it has been challenged. And we see a snapshot of that for these people. This was for them the way and the place by which they engaged God together. And is it perfect? No. Is it overstated? Yeah, but they wrote it. It was that if we were to write the story of our stuff, we would put in details that 2,000, 5,000 years from now, people may not care about much either. But the things that are sacred to us, you clearly feel that as you read this, that somebody cared how many onyx things were on the priest's shoulder. Somebody cared what color this embroidery. I mean, it mattered to them, and we can't fault them just because it matters less to us.
But that's the beautiful tensions I see in this section, Clint, is all of the this and that's, right? This is, yes, they cared about the onyx, they cared deeply about the bronze, they cared deeply about the basin and the oil, they cared about the ephods, all of that they cared about. And at the end of the day, those things would not even remain when they went into the temple. Like, there would be analogs of many of those things, but a lot of that stuff would be different when they had their own permanent space, and certainly when on the other side of Jesus Christ. And on the other hand, I think it's just these things are sacred and set apart, and simultaneously they're common, and they only exist for the purpose of serving the worshiping people. That's the people who are living. That's an expression of our lives. And yeah, if you look at this, if you read these chapters, I don't blame you if you think to yourself,
glad we're done with them.
Yeah, I don't blame you for that. On the other hand, if we can see that in it, we might see ourselves in it. And I think that's a beautiful gift.
The good news is that next week we're done with them.
We got it done.
And we will be moving on to stories that are more familiar and I think maybe stories that are more accessible.
Thanks for being with us. Hope there's been something interesting here today. Look forward to seeing you as we kick off another full week next week.
Thanks, everybody.